thrilled to be speaking today to Laura Spinney, who's the author of Pale Rider, which is a brilliant book about the 1918 flu. Laura is a novelist, translator, and science writer here in Paris, and this is a science book written with a novelist's touch. It's a very rich cultural and scientific history of how the flu spread around the world. So I wanted to begin by asking you, Laura, how you came to write this book, which came out in 2017. How did you come to write this book about the Spanish flu of 1918? How did you get interested in that topic?
Well, it was all about forgetting, really. So about 2013, 2014, I was discussing with various editors I write for about how we were going to cover the centenary of the Great War, the First World War. And because we're science journalists, we were thinking about the scientific aspects. And so I was being sent off to do things like battlefield archaeology and to talk to people in doing strange things like that. And in the course of my research, I kept coming across this other disaster, which essentially overlapped with the First World War. And yet we weren't talking about the centenary of that. And when I did my first Google into the so-called Spanish flu and saw the numbers that were associated with that, I was just like, gobsmacked. Why aren't we talking about this one? It killed so many more people than the First World War. So
Pamela, can you pull up that slide, please? Thanks. Please, Laura, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, it started with the idea of forgetting why, when this was, you know, by far the biggest disaster of the 20th century in terms of sheer loss of life, we weren't talking about it. And so it was kind of partly an exploration of the reasons for that. And, you know, there are lots of reasons which I explore in my book, but one of the ones that I've been thinking a bit about lately kind of was brought home to me by that front page of the New York Times yesterday, which listed all the names of the dead, a kind of beautiful gesture, I think. And the point being that we, you know, these people kind of get lost in the statistics and the numbers, and it was to remind us that every single one was a tragedy. But somehow we don't need so much reminding of that with a war. And I was talking to a war correspondent about this the other day, and we wondered if it was something to do with the visual imagery of these kinds of disasters and the fact that, you know, the core event of both is something rather gruesome and grisly to look at in different ways. But in a war, we're left with those images. We see those people dying. And in a pandemic, we don't, because the death tends to take place behind walls, in private spaces. And so we have loads of images of people wearing masks or carrying empty stretchers, but we don't really see the core event. And I wonder if that has something to do with it.
Could we have the next slide, please, Pamela? So, Laura, this was a massive event between 1918 and essentially when the flu then eventually died out. Tell us a little bit about its scope, its reach in time and space, how it all unfolded.
Yeah, so I should kind of give you the kind of brief overview. So we think it infected 500 million people, 1 in 3 people on Earth at the time, and that it killed between 50 and 100 million of them, which equates to about 2.5 to 5% of the global population at that time. It swept over the world in 3 waves, a mild first wave in the early months of 1918, a very lethal second wave in the latter part of 1918, and then a third wave that was intermediate in severity between the other 2 in the early months of 1919. And just to give you an idea, so the dates of the waves and how many waves you had, in fact, depended on where you were in the world. And they tended to be staggered in time in the southern hemisphere with respect to the north. So they came later in the south. And the last record we have really of the pandemic raging is in the Pacific Isles in July of 1921. So overall, you could say it lasted a little over 3 years. But the bulk of those 50 million deaths, if we take the minimum number, happened in 13 weeks between the middle of September and the middle of December 1918. So the core of it happened in the blink of an eye.
And which areas of Earth were most affected?
Okay, so this map actually shows, this is the kind of frontispiece to my book, and it shows the way that that lethal second wave moved around the world. It actually shows 2 separate things. So first of all, there's the shaded pattern, which just shows how it arrived. So the black areas there where it arrived first in August of 1918, and then it kind of spread out from there. So the white areas are not areas that didn't get it, they're just the areas that got it last. In fact, there were very few places on Earth that didn't get it. The black dots just give you an idea of the variability in mortality across the globe, which was enormous. So you can see, for example, Bristol Bay in Alaska, 40% of the population died from the flu. And this is one of the most interesting comparisons because we're still in the United States of America. If you go over to New York City, it was 0.5%. In India, 6%, but India was the country that lost the largest number of people in absolute terms in the whole world. 18 million Indians died. So that's the equivalent of the death toll of the First World War in its entirety. And so on. You can see the pattern of variability across the globe there.
Could we have the next slide, please, Pamela? So this is something that stretched across the whole world, but it affected some parts of the world, Africa and Asia, a lot more. Yeah. Is that in terms of absolute numbers of deaths?
I mean, just to talk you through a little bit this picture, we have some images of the 1918 flu, not a lot, and almost all of them are from North America, which is a tribute to photography in America at that time. But it's not very representative because Asia and Africa were the continents that bore the brunt of the pandemic. North America, Europe, and Australia had the lowest death rates in general. And that probably reflects socioeconomic differences because as in this current pandemic, those shaped that pandemic very strongly. So I just like to show this picture because it's one of the few that kind of gives you a sense of people being affected outside Caucasian populations. This is Japanese schoolgirls wearing masks in 1920, actually, which is when the second wave struck Japan, the most dangerous wave. What else did you ask me?
No, that was what I was asking you. I'd like to move on to the next slide, please, Pamela. So this is, yes, an image from the West. So Laura, what are we looking at here, and why was the 1918 pandemic eventually called the Spanish flu?
Okay, so this is kind of the iconic image of the so-called Spanish flu, and you can see why. It gives a really great sense of the sort of scale of it and the fact that everybody fell ill all at once at one time. This is soldiers at Camp Funston in Kansas in the autumn of 1918 in the sanatorium, and you know, basically the pandemic kind of came in this great big wave, the second wave, the worst one, and swept over the world. And this conveys that very well. And it's pretty much the image that's associated with the pandemic. So to get to your question about why it's called the Spanish flu, it's curious and a historical irony and a terrible injustice, really, that it is called that, but names tend to stick. There are so many questions about that pandemic to which we don't have answers, but one of the few things we're certain about is that it wasn't Spanish. We know that there were cases in the United States, in France, in Britain, and in some of the Axis countries, at least before there were in Spain. But those countries being implicated in the war tended to censor their press, and so kept that information out of the newspapers.
Like which countries?
America, Britain, France, all the above. Because they supposedly didn't want to lower the morale of their populations. Spain, being neutral in the war, didn't censor its press. And so when the first cases occurred there in the spring of 1918, they reported on them. And they included the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, who actually went on to recover, but his case lent a lot of visibility. So it seemed even to Spanish people, even to French people who had it in their midst, and to everybody else in the world reading their newspapers, that it was rippling out from Madrid.
Laura, is there a reasonable guess as to where it began?
Yeah. There are three theories on the table today, which correspond to origins in China, an interior province that borders with Mongolia, called Shaanxi, in Kansas, not far from Camp Funston, where the first official cases were recorded, and at a British Army base in northern France at a place called Étaples, just south of Boulogne-sur-Mer. We can't choose between those today, though it's a very live question. People are still working on it. And some test tubes just cropped up the other day containing samples of lung tissue from victims of the first wave, and of earlier outbreaks of respiratory disease, we don't quite know what they were, at Etaples, at the British Army base in France. And they might hold the clue. If they're not too degraded, we might be able to compare them to the sequences we already have of the viruses that caused the pandemic proper and say where it started. So it's not impossible.
And why do you think it's actually important to know where it started?
Well, it's a good question. It's not going to help save anybody's life. It's obviously a matter of historical interest. It might help us understand the kind of mechanism that causes zoonotic diseases to spill over from animals into humans. We know it came from a bird. It could have come from a bird via a pig, or it could have come directly from a bird into humans. Knowing that would help us prevent such things happening again, or at least to be able to look out for them and to reduce their impact when they happen. But basically, probably just to let the Spanish off the hook and prove that they were actually innocent after all.
Yeah, and so this Camp Funston images, these are also soldiers who were headed to the front in the First World War, and troop movements kind of also help spread the flu around the world.
Yeah, I mean, so sorry, you were going to get to your question.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, so one of the big lingering questions is why this pandemic was so lethal, because we've had probably 15 flu pandemics in the last 500 years. There were 2 more in the 20th century, for example, one in 1957, one in 1968. Neither of those killed more than 4 million people, and those were fairly lethal in the annals of flu pandemics. So when you think that the Spanish flu killed at least 50 million, it was way out there in a league of its own. And so people are asking why. And it was probably multifactorial. We know, for example, that particular strain of flu was inherently quite virulent. But it probably also had a lot to do with the exceptional condition of the world at that moment, because it was at war. And the fact that lots of people were on the move, troops were on the move, but also civilians. We're talking about the tail end of the war. So there were many displaced persons, refugees. They were hungry. There was famine in large stretches of the world. They were stressed. Their doctors were away at the front. All sorts of reasons. Healthcare campaigns, such as they were at the time, were interrupted. War tends to bring pandemics in its wake. And it may also, there are theories, which I can explain if you want, though it'll take a little time, as to how the existence of the trenches and the fact that young men were packed into them might have actually contributed to the ratcheting up of the virulence of the virus. And so there may have been an interaction there as well.
Could we have the next slide? Could you tell us a little bit more about the virulence of the virus and how it actually played out, and what we knew about, what did we know about the science at that time? I mean, we didn't know as much as we do now.
So, I mean, the flu is a curious thing to get your head around, because normally it is mild in the vast majority of cases, but it still kills a lot of people every year, even seasonal flu. Seasonal flu in Europe, for example, kills 40,000 people a year. And that's, seasonal flu is the kind of mild variety with which we live every year. Pandemic flu, which is a new strain that's come out and happens to be contagious enough to spread around the world, is always more virulent because it hasn't had time yet to adapt to the human race, human species rather. And if you look at the world from the point of view of a virus that is transmitted from host to host, it's in your interests to keep your host alive because you want your host to travel far and wide and spread you about. So these viruses tend to evolve over time to become more benign. But this one was particularly virulent, and yet it still only killed a small percentage of those that infected. Remember those figures I gave you at the beginning, 500 million infected and 50 million dead. The severe form, the minority in whom it became severe, they developed these horrible symptoms. It started out like ordinary flu, sore throat, headache, fever, and so on. And then they started having difficulty breathing. And then they turned blue in the face, this effect called heliotrope cyanosis. And then they started bleeding from their noses and mouths. I could go on, but basically they gradually turn black and then they die. So it really was something quite extraordinary, and it didn't look anything like flu. And the important thing to understand is that virus being a relatively new concept at that time, the first viruses had only been identified at the tail end of the previous century, almost no doctor in the world, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, thought that they were dealing with a virus. They were convinced it was a bacterial disease. And what that means is they had no reliable diagnostic test. They wouldn't have been able to make one anyway if they had suspected it was a virus, although they learned too quickly later on. And so there was massive confusion around it. And that's one of the reasons why we have this huge range of possible death rates, because it was called cholera, which also turns you blue in the face. It was called typhus, which starts out with flu-like symptoms. It was called pneumonic plague. And because it often finished people off who had other diseases, rather like COVID, you know, it was also confounded with those other diseases in the same patient. So it was just a terrible diagnostic mess.
And it also, you know, it led to certain advances in science. I mean, doctors were kind of trying to cure it, but there wasn't really a vaccine developed until much after the pandemic died out.
Well, they did actually. I mean, if you think about vaccination, it's a much older concept. So they did try to build vaccines in 1918, but the vaccines they were building were against bacteria, the bacteria that opportunistically colonized the respiratory tracts of those people who'd already been infected by the flu. And that produced the ironic situation where those vaccines actually had an effect in some patients, because they protected them from the bacterial pneumonia, which killed the vast majority of the victims. And that was very confusing to everyone trying to sort out whether it was a virus or a bacteria at the origin of this. But of course, they didn't have any really effective vaccine. They were, you know, that was only, overall, they were pretty ineffective, their vaccines. They didn't have any antiviral drugs. Those weren't invented until the 1960s. And they didn't have any antibiotics, which would have, again, helped with that terminal bacterial stage, because those weren't invented until after the Second World War. So they were really almost completely powerless. They had aspirin, the so-called wonder drug, but because they didn't know about the difference between a medicine and a poison and when the dose pushes you over from one to the other, they often gave too high doses of that and aggravated the problem. So doctors were almost a liability at that time. In fact, your best hope was to have a good nurse who kept you warm and hydrated and, you know, saw you over the worst of the fever.
Pamela, could I ask you to give us the next slide, please? Laura, this is one of the illustrious dead, I'm afraid. What can you tell us about this image, and who got this flu most often?
Yeah, so this kind of, for me, distills the real tragedy of it all, as if there wasn't enough tragedy in 50 million deaths. But this flu was unusual compared to, say, the normal seasonal flu that comes around every year, in that it targeted the very young, the very old. Seasonal flu does that, but it also targeted this middle age group of the 20 to 40-year-olds, and more men than women. Egon Schiele painted this. This was his last painting, which he painted in the autumn of 1918, of his family, a family that would actually never exist, because his wife, Edith, died of the Spanish flu in October 1918, 6 months pregnant with their first child. He painted this essentially in the days that followed her death, before he expired with Spanish flu at the age of 28, which was the peak age of death in that middle age group. So this family never existed. This is kind of a testament to the horrible way that disease purged human communities that time. And you have to remember that it was a time when there was little or no, even in the richest countries, little or no social welfare net. So you're taking out the pillars of communities, the producers, the parents of families, and there was nothing to catch those left behind, the children, the orphans, or the elderly dependents. So you see, I mean, we don't have a lot of evidence about what happened to those left behind, but there are kind of anecdotal glimpses, fascinating and worrying anecdotal glimpses of elderly people moving into workhouses, and orphans kind of ending up vagrants in the street or getting drawn into crime and prostitution.
Could we have the next
Laura,
slide? Yeah.
Can I just ask, why were 20 to 40-year-olds killed? So unlike COVID, given that this is the strongest group you'd think in society.
Yeah, so it's another open question. We don't know the answer definitively, but the kind of leading theory, I suppose, has to do with an idea called original antigenic sin. So, so this is the idea that your immune system is primed by the first strain of flu that it ever encounters in life. So the first one you encounter as a child. And that's basically the best, the most honed, the most adapted immune response that you'll ever have to flu in the rest of your life. And every response to flu you generate afterwards will be a sort of modification of that is more or less adapted to the strain in question. And people who were aged 20 to 40 in 1918, probably the first strain they were exposed to in childhood was the strain that caused, or the subtype that caused the previous pandemic, the so-called Russian flu of the 1890s, which we think was H3N8. 1918 was caused by H1N1. So they're very different types of influenza A. Influenza changes all the time, so there are all sorts of families and subfamilies. You have to just take my word for it on the nomenclature. And that means that their immune systems were not very well adapted to this new type of flu that emerged in 1918, and therefore they were at a disadvantage.
Could we have the next slide, Pamela, please? So one of the great things about Pale Rider Laura's book is that she talks about the political and cultural consequences and fallout of this pandemic. What's this image? And tell us a little bit about which parts of the world and which cities handled the pandemic better than others.
So, I mean, this image to me it's such a great image. It's so sharp and it looks so modern in a way. It kind of speaks to the issue of mass gatherings. So, you know, even before germ theory, which was invented in the 19th century, even before we understood that infectious diseases were caused by microbes, whether they be bacteria, viruses, or something else, we understood that to stop contagion, you have to separate the sick from the healthy. And so things like quarantine, that dates from the 15th century, cordon sanitaire, they're very old, these concepts. Isolation is mentioned in the Bible. So mass gatherings were in general banned in those countries that were able and willing to put in place public health measures, because that was relatively rare. And especially, you know, in this context of war, many countries either didn't have the resources or the manpower to put in place or police public health measures, or they just had other priorities. I mean, this is a picture from America. Public health measures were put in place quite, probably the best in the world in America, but there was huge variability across the country, and there wasn't massive help. This may sound familiar. There wasn't massive help from the federal government because Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, certainly made a priority of the war effort. So for him, the war effort trumped everything else. And that meant, for example, that he wouldn't hear about stopping the transports that took the troops across the Atlantic to Europe. And those became basically horrible scenes of death because they were infected with the flu. And the other thing about it is that, of course, it was a time when organized religion was much more powerful than today. And it was also a time after 4 years of grinding, miserable war, when people were psychologically worn down. And I think probably it was just easier for them to, especially when they saw how helpless the doctors were against this scourge, it was just easier for them to turn to a religious response at some point when they saw the doctors were helpless. And so compliance fell off, even in those places where mass gatherings had been banned or other public health measures had been put in place. And people prayed because they were afraid, and that was their last resort to try and protect themselves against this disease. And in fact, there's one lovely thing I turned up in my research when I went to Odessa, which was in Russia at the time, now in Ukraine. And there in the newspaper archives, I found this beautiful description of what's called a black wedding. So Odessa's population was very Jewish at that time. It was less Jewish later on, unfortunately. But and a black wedding is a kind of rather obscure, it was even considered blasphemous at that time, though some rabbis blessed its comeback because of the general climate. It's when two marginalized people in society, often beggars, are married to each other. They're strangers to each other, and they give their consent, and they're married to each other in a cemetery with a huge party. And this is supposed to ward off the plague. And that happened in Odessa. It happened across Eastern Europe, but we also have reports from Mount Hebron Cemetery in New York and also from Winnipeg in Canada. So just to give you an indication of how frightened people were.
People were frightened all around the world. I mean, in your book, you talk about how this kind of defied belief among religious people across the United States and South Africa, like all around the world. There was this sense of what is this thing and how does it strike so randomly?
Yes, and I think that is that is a little bit part of human nature and what we do in pandemics. I mean, if you look at our response to this particular pandemic we're living through now, we all saw it coming out of China, and the attitude was, oh, what's gone wrong over there? And then when it got to Italy, it was like, oh, what have the Italians done wrong? It's like the attitude is always, it can't possibly come here until it comes here. And then it's like, oh, panic. And it's not new, that has been around forever. I've just been reading a book actually about the phylloxera epidemic in France. It was exactly the same thing. French vine growers saw it coming. They saw it in the neighboring vineyard and they still thought, what has my neighbor done wrong? It won't come here, until their own vines were wiped out. It's what we do.
This image is San Francisco. So San Francisco compared to other cities in the United States seemed, it did better, it did worse.
I think it did worse. Now I can't remember the exact statistics on US cities. I have to warn you here.
But internationally, you could maybe talk about how it you know, some places had more developed healthcare, some didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, but the pattern of measures that put in place in each city, even across the United States, was very different. It depended on the local context. New York was an interesting example because New York was one of the few places, along with Odessa actually, where they kept the schools open. So it's always a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to close the schools. And it's probably in general a good thing when it comes to flu, because kids are just huge vehicles of infectious disease in general. And, you know, when you've got large numbers of people, children in this instance, moving backwards and forwards across cities all the time, bringing, you know, mingling, bringing things home, that might be something you want to stop. But New York took a different attitude, kept the schools open. And I think what I found from my research is that that probably had something to do with the health commissioner looking at the population he was dealing with and seeing, because New York at that time was in the middle of a wave of huge immigration. And so there were a lot of very poor people, particularly Italians. That was the fastest growing group in New York at the time, living in terrible accommodation, sometimes 10 to a room, malnourished, often not speaking English, in some ways removed from the, you know, the whole public health campaign infrastructure information machine. And he wanted to keep the schools open, first to keep the children under surveillance so that they could be treated if they did fall ill, because he was afraid that if they weren't there, they would come in invisible, and also to use them as kind of messengers to take the message back to their parents, the public health message, who, as I said, often didn't speak English. So that was a decision which you can see was shaped by the local context. I think is interesting.
Laura, just before we come on to the global political implications, which were large, is there a country or a city you would point to and say, given the lack of scientific knowledge at the time, they did a pretty good job?
New York is usually held up as an example of a city that did a pretty good job. But otherwise, it's who did the worst job, who did the least worst job.
Well, who did the worst job?
I'll give you an example. Even though the Spanish weren't responsible for this epidemic, there's a city that I visited for my research, Zamora in northwestern Spain, that is and was extremely religious. And at the time, the local bishop, who was very powerful, very charismatic, basically overruled all the public health committees and said, go away, you're not welcome here. In my city, we will all go to church and pray for forgiveness because we're essentially being punished for our sins. And so he ordered everybody into the churches to say mass and to do novenas and all kinds of rituals to ward off the plague. And Zamora recorded the highest death rate from flu in Spain and in Europe, in fact.
So many contemporary resonances.
But also, for example, Persia, failing state at the time, had a very high death rate, probably somewhere around 25%, because nobody was in charge, because the government was bankrupt. This is essentially the fault of the British and the Germans fighting over it, British and the Russians fighting over it, and each one trying to stymie the other's attempts to put in place any kind of public health infrastructure for political reasons. So again, everywhere you look, you see how the biology and the politics and the social factors interact to shape the pandemic.
which brings us to our next question. The flu is so intertwined with World War I and the end of World War I. And there's a lot of interest from some of the listeners and from Simon and me about the geopolitical implications of this. We're looking at an image of Woodrow Wilson. Maybe you could talk a little bit about him and how the flu affected him. And then I'd love it if you could kind of take a little tour of other parts of the world, India, South Africa. But start with this image, please.
So Woodrow Wilson, having, kind of put down the importance of the flu earlier in the war, he then turns up at the Paris Peace Conference in the early months of 1919, and he, among many other delegates, comes down with the flu in that third wave. It basically coincides with the Paris Peace Conference in the early months of 1919. And what's interesting about his case, and so did his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, what's interesting about his case is that if you read the eyewitness reports of that conference from the time, he seemed to change character. He seemed to become less tolerant, less reflective, less willing to listen and hear people out. And of course, he had an incredibly important role at that conference because he was the moderate one. And he was the one who was trying to bring back the kind of vengeful, the big four, the vengeful European leaders from wanting to punish Germany too heavily. But gradually, he becomes more fractious, less tolerant, less willing to listen, and neurologists have studied his case retrospectively, which is a difficult exercise to do. So everything I say comes with the caveat that they're doing by reading reports. They're not examining the patient, obviously, but they think that he had some kind of underlying neurological weakness, and that the flu in him triggered mini strokes, tics. We call them transient ischemic attacks. And that's what gradually changed his personality, in fact, that spring. And we know that small mini strokes like that definitely predispose you to bigger strokes at a later date. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, went on to have a very major stroke that autumn, which left him paralyzed down one side and unable to persuade Congress to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or to join the League of Nations. So in this one case, there's a little bit of great man history, if you like. But in this one case, you can see how the flu had a very long shadow in geopolitical terms.
And in terms of the conditions that were placed on Germany after the First World War, which then brought it to its knees and then led to...
Arguably brought on the Second World War, yeah. Exactly.
That's a pretty major geopolitical consequence. What about, I was struck in your book, you talk about South Africa. Could you just talk a little bit about how the pandemic played out there and the politics of that place?
Yeah, so I mean, South Africa and India are quite interesting examples to contrast, because they show how the moment when the pandemic strikes the society, it basically, the effect it has depends on the context it falls into locally. There's not one effect that the pandemic has across the globe. And so in South Africa, basically what you see is the kind of stirrings of apartheid before the pandemic arrives there. And when the disease arrives, whites are blaming blacks, blacks are blaming whites. And in the early 1920s, you see the first laws passed of apartheid, basically the segregation of cities. The first law is passed in the early 1920s. So the idea is that this blaming, these tensions that were fanned by the pandemic, and of course the black population, well, of course, not of course, but the black population experienced much higher mortality rates than the white population. There was very little healthcare provision in place for them at the time, and that was probably a contributing factor. And so, it fueled these tensions, and the laws are passed, and then apartheid goes on for 60 years before it's brought to an end. So there's another long shadow.
And it also spreads among miners, workers in the mines, and
yeah, the whole thing is, yeah, it arrives in the mines on the, because South Africa has a very well developed train network at the time, because it's being exploited for its rich mineral resources by the colonial powers, and so there's this it's very well connected. And when the flu arrives on troop ships bringing troops back from the war in Europe, they're basically not properly quarantined, and the flu spreads a little bit, and it gets onto the trains, and it goes eventually to the mines, and the miners flee the mines, terrified, not wanting to die, and they take it back to their native places, to their rural villages. And so that's how the disease spreads very easily in South Africa. And it's known as Black October, October 1918 in South Africa. And there's actually quite a good memory, interestingly, of the disaster in that country. It's actually commemorated quite well. But so, yeah, you see how it kind of tangles up with the socio-political context. And India,
yeah.
In India, you could say, if you think of South Africa as a negative effect, in India, you could think of it as a positive effect, in the sense that it had a big impact on the nascent independence movement. So it arrives in India at the time when Gandhi has only recently, 3 years earlier, come back from South Africa. And he's sort of emerging as the national leader as the future national leader, as the leader of the independence movement. But he doesn't yet have grassroots support. And that's demonstrated by the fact that he organizes a couple of peaceful protests in, I think it's February of 1918, before the flu arrives. And he's trying to bring the peasants out to protest on what they perceive as unjust land taxes or low pay, workers in textile mills on low pay. And he brings out thousands of them, not hundreds of thousands of them. And then the pandemic strikes. And what happens is that Gandhi falls ill that autumn, and he falls very ill. And he probably develops pneumonia. We can't be sure about that, but he's ill for a number of months. So it probably got complicated in his case. And so the head of the movement is kind of taken out. And also all the other people who are prominent in the independence movement and who live at his ashram in Gujarat are ill at the same time. And what happens is that also the very poor colonial provision of healthcare for the indigenous population is itself overwhelmed, partly because it was never very good in the first place, but then the doctors that there were off at the front in many cases. And so the British colonial authorities realized that they cannot in any way cope with the coming disaster, and they put out a plea for help. And the people who step into the breach and answer that plea are, in general, local kind of grassroots organizations that are linked, that are connected with social reform, wanting to reform the caste system, for example, and with the independence movement, because those things often go together. And they kind of mobilize their volunteers to distribute milk, to distribute blankets, to set up man influenza relief centers. And that probably what they were offering in terms of treatments, because they also offered vaccines, we don't really know what their vaccines were, and so-called treatments. Probably what it was Ayurveda, because Western medicine wasn't really very accepted in India yet at that point. So it's probably no more effective, no less effective than the pretty useless Western medicine being offered at that time. But that's not the point. The point is that this effort takes them out into rural communities, takes them all over the place and brings them into contact with people of different castes, different communities, different religions. And they begin to kind of build this grassroots network. And because they bring help at time of need and people are dying in large numbers, there's an enormous amount of gratitude that they earn, an enormous following that they build up. And so they're kind of building this kind of grassroots movement. And after the pandemic, when Gandhi is recovered and taken up the charge again, he brings them in. He brings in these local activists who did so much good work during the pandemic, and they become part of his inner circle in a way. And he takes them to a big meeting of the Indian Congress Party in 1920, I think, in Calcutta. Some of them are actually in his specially chartered train that goes from Bombay to Calcutta. And he promises at this meeting independence within a year if I bring people out in national protest. Okay, it was a bit premature, but these activists go back home inspired and they bring their own followings out. And in 1921, when there was a general strike, I think there were 500,000 people out on strike at that point. Wow. So something had changed, and he now had grassroots support. And you can trace the impact of the flu all the way through that.
What would you say are some of the most lingering consequences on different societies of the 1918 pandemic, kind of socially and culturally?
Well, I always think about the lost generation. I mean, the lost generation means different things to different people. But for me, the lost generation is those people who were, so you know, I said that 20 to 40-year-olds were particularly vulnerable. In that group, men were more vulnerable than women, but pregnant women were particularly vulnerable, and they had miscarriages and died at extremely high rates. So their unborn babies were the kind of unborn generation, because there were millions of them. We don't know exactly how many, but they were extremely numerous, much more numerous probably than the babies not born because of the First World War. And then there are those babies who were born, who survived whatever physiological stresses were targeted at them by the flu in their mother's stomachs. And they were, this has been measured, this has been studied, they were psychologically, cognitively, and physically diminished compared to the cohorts, age cohorts either side of them. So you can measure the impact of the flu on them in the womb, and that carried through all through their lives. And if you think about it, we're only just beyond the end of their lifespan, their would have been lifespan. So they were, I mean, there are all sorts of things that have been measured. They were more likely to suffer heart disease, more likely to be out of work, more likely to go to prison, all kinds of things that indicate they were socially and physically disadvantaged. They were also, unfortunately, the generation who came of age just as the Second World War declared itself. So they were the ones who had to fight that war. They were a very unlucky generation. So if you think about that big dent in the human population going through the years, I think that is, you know, a very interesting, it just gives you an indication of the impact and the length of time that it lasted. But we can also talk about the impact on science, or the impact on medicine, healthcare systems, and so on.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that maybe towards the end, and we have some reader questions. But first, I'd like to ask you if you could kind of bring this back a little bit to the present, and again, tell us some of your thoughts about how the 1918 pandemic has kind of repercussions and reflections on the current one that we're living through.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I often get asked to compare the two, and I have to start with the caveat that I don't think they're comparable in terms of scale. Okay, I explained that I think the Spanish flu was a real anomaly, and we're still trying to understand why it was so anomalous. I think that this one is much more comparable in terms of scale to one of the later flu pandemics of the 20th century, which nobody talks about. Those have been well and truly forgotten. Now they're overshadowed both by COVID and by the Spanish flu.
You mean like the Hong Kong flu,
1957 so-called Asian flu, the 1968 so-called Hong Kong flu. First didn't kill more than 2 million, the second not more than 4 million. We hope we don't get anywhere near even those numbers, of course, with COVID, but already they're better comparisons. Having said that about the numbers, though, I think there are plenty of historical parallels that you can draw. And the obvious one, I suppose, is that in this period when we don't have a vaccine, and let's face it, the pandemic may end before we do have one, we don't have any very effective antiviral treatments. We are really essentially reliant on the same social distancing measures that they had in 1918, isolation, quarantine, masks, closing of schools, banning of mass gatherings. These are age-old measures, and they're the same ones they were using 100 years ago, and we're having the same debates. Should we close schools? Shouldn't we? Should we wear masks? Shouldn't we? Which is more important, the economy or the health of individuals? And so in many ways, it feels extremely ancient to me, this pandemic.
There's a audience question about the 1920s and this era of great creative, fervor. And what about that? I mean, do you think that the pandemic kind of had an effect on culture in that way? Did it just kind of unleash something after it eventually faded away?
Yeah, well, so one of the curious things about pandemics is that we seem to bounce back from them really quickly. And we bounce back demographically. So one of the really interesting things actually is there was a baby boom, global baby boom in the 1920s. And this has always been put down to the war. So the idea is the men came back from the front and there was a wave of babies. What's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah.
Conceptions. But the trouble is that there's research that shows that there was a baby boom even in neutral countries. There was a baby boom in Norway, for example, where the men didn't go away. So the idea is that the flu actually contributed to this baby boom too. And the mechanism is as follows. Because it purged the weakest in society, for example, TB was a huge problem at that time. And they were often the first to die of the flu, already had compromised lungs. So it took out many of the weakest people in society and it left behind a smaller, healthier population, which was then able to reproduce at a higher rate. So that's the idea. Of course, those babies are not, so humanity has changed radically. Lots of people have died. It's not the same individual. So when I say bounce back, I mean at the population level. Obviously there had been huge amounts of human suffering and tragedy paved the way for that.
But culturally, yeah.
So the economy also bounces back really quickly. And culturally, I'm not sure that you can talk about a bounce back, but if you have an economic bounce back, that tends to make people happy. And so then they spend money and they party and so on. So the roaring 20s, yes, I think you could say that the pandemic fed into that in some way. But there is also always this terrible difficulty with 1918 about disentangling the effects of the war and the pandemic. We can't do that. You just can't do it. All I'm trying to say in my book is that we've always put these things down to the war, and maybe we should think about the flu having had made a contribution. But culturally, there was a huge shift. There was a huge shift, and in you see lots of new trends emerging, which again have always been put down to the war. So you see kind of a nihilistic streak coming in, a kind of absurdist streak, and you see a new fascination with the body, not as metaphor, as in, for example, the Magic Mountain, but in its own right, interesting in its own right. We're interested now in how the body fails in its own right.
In whose works?
Well, Virginia Woolf was always talking about how the body fails, but for example, Mrs. Dalloway is a kind of like icon, with obsession with mental illness, of how people became interested in disease in its own right from the 1920s on. And you see it all over the world, actually. And you also see a real interest in kind of the vernacular, in wanting to speak for the peasants, for the poorest, for the people, the most downtrodden in society. You kind of see a democratization of the of literature and art in general. And there are theories that's linked to the fact that suddenly people were conscious at the time that those were the people who had suffered the most. It's
also another thing that's happening just then is the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which is another force of change in people's thinking. I was wondering about the effect within certain families, because 100 years is not very long in the lifetime of a family. And Rachel sent me something today about Donald Trump's family, how flu changed its course. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so one of the immigrants who died in New York City of the Spanish flu in the autumn of 1918 was Friedrich Trump, an immigrant from Germany, was it?
Yes, Germany.
Germany.
And he left behind a widow and a son, and they came into a small amount of money from his will. And actually it was the widow who was the real estate genius. She invested it in real estate and made a packet, which she passed on to her son. And then he passed it on to his son, and that person is Donald Trump.
Wow, so he's a third generation rich person, not a second generation one. That's news, and all thanks to the flu.
Third generation,